Thank you, Liz, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today, to Stephen in particular and to CEDA. I've addressed, of course, CEDA in the past, both in government and opposition, and I'm planning on this being my last address to you as Shadow Treasurer, and I look forward to being back next year to talk about the shortened Labor government's first budget. But I do congratulate you on this paper and this process. Better retirement income policy is one of the key areas for improvement in our public policy life. And this discussion will be an important one. I'm privileged to be here sharing the platform with distinguished speakers such as Jeremy Cooper, Cassandra Goldie and David Knox, each a considered thinker in their own right and a valued contributor to our economic debate. Now, there's been a lot of talk about reform, rightly and rightly so. Our 24 years of uninterrupted economic growth do provide us with a very good platform. But the fact is that growth is weaker now than for much of those 24 years. And there's no guarantee that our run of growth will continue. It won't continue without competence and courage from policymakers. A lack of either of these will see our unprecedented success crashing to a halt. Now, agreeing on what this reform should look like is an altogether harder proposition than reaching consensus that reform should occur. Sometimes the current debate reminds me of the scene from a movie you may remember, a comedy classic, Brother, Where Art Thou?, in which the less than acute Junior O'Daniel reminds his politician father, "A lot of people like that reform, maybe we should get ourselves some." Of course, one area which must be successfully reformed is retirement incomes and superannuation in particular. We start from a position of strength. There's no reason for complacency or drive to make the system, however, fairer and more sustainable. Our three-pillar system of the age pension, superannuation concessions and private savings is a well-balanced system, providing a necessary safety net but also limiting the liability for government through mandatory private savings. In this period of increased market volatility, let's not forget the broader financial stability that our retirement income system also provides us with. Australia's now $2 trillion of superannuation savings assisted the country during the worst consequences of the global financial crisis. Our national savings pool helped our businesses grow at a time when they could not acquire the finance from the normal channels, ultimately being one of the factors in assisting us in avoiding recession. And with superannuation assets expected to grow to 160% of GDP within the next 30 years, our system is well placed to continue the support for the Australian economy should it be needed again in the future. But the domestic and global challenges facing the nation mean it's even more important to position our retirement income system for the next 50 years and beyond. Our retirement system is world leading, but it has its challenges. And as the National Reform Summit reminded us last week, while the fundamental architecture of our system is in good shape, it can be improved. We continue to operate without a clear and agreed objective. As CEDA's report released today says, there is a disconnect and confusion amongst the public, industry and government regarding the objectives of our retirement income system. The government's own financial system review and more recently last week's summit reminded us that the balance and the absence of a clear, overarching objective for the retirement income system is important to ensure that policies are consistent and transparent in achieving a common outcome. Now, I've consistently said now for months that Labor supports a clear, legislated and preferably bipartisan objective for our superannuation system. I've made my own suggestion as a starting point that we agree that our superannuation system should ensure that as many Australians as possible have access to the resources for a dignified retirement without recourse to the full aged pension. If the government has its own suggestion, I'd be happy to hear it, and I'd be happy to sit down and work it through with them. An objective for our superannuation system would be very useful because it would enable us to judge suggested changes to superannuation against that objective, whether they would further the criteria or be damaging to the objective. Now, on that note, I do need to sound one note of disagreement with CEDA. As Stephen said, a robust debate is a good thing. I don't believe in gilding the lily or glossing over areas of disagreement when making speeches such as this. One of the recommendations in the CEDA report today is that first home buyers should be able to access superannuation to purchase their first homes. I respectfully but profoundly disagree. We have the lived experience of first homeowner grants unaccompanied by increases in housing supply. They simply drive up prices further. In this case, the policy implications would be more severe. Allowing access to superannuation savings for first home buyers will drive up prices at the same time as whittling away retirement incomes. A highly regretful double whammy. Housing affordability is a very significant problem, and we've been working in the opposition away on potential solutions. But allowing superannuation to be used for something which is not its purpose is not one of those solutions, and one we will not and cannot support. But this is exactly why an agreed objective, legislated, is urgently needed, because it will allow policy proposals, which come up regularly, to be viewed through the prism of helping people achieve a dignified retirement. Now, today I want to focus on one particular area which I do not believe receives enough attention in our public debate on superannuation. And it's been a focus for our policy development as well. It's the scourge of the gap in retirement incomes between men and women in Australia. And until we make genuine progress in giving women improved retirement incomes, our system will be failing in that key objective of providing as many Australians as possible with a dignified retirement. Now, of course, the gap in retirement incomes is in large measure a result of the gender gap in incomes more generally. Australian Bureau of Statistics data shows that the current pay gap between men and women in Australia is 19%. In fact, for every single industry, there's a pay gap favouring men. And we've made pitifully slow progress in moving this dial over the last 20 years. But it's not good enough to shrug our shoulders and say because there's a gender gap in incomes, we should also accept an iniquitous gap in retirement incomes as well. And we can't stand by and condemn millions of women to a less than adequate retirement income to see them through their retirement. We need to make genuine progress in giving women a fairer go in the workforce, but we also need to be improving the superannuation system to make up for at least some of this inequity while it continues to exist. Now let's briefly recap the scale of the problem. Rice-Warner analysis shows that the current wage discrepancy compounds through life to an estimated superannuation gap of 47% by retirement. This means that women retire with around half the retirement savings of their male counterparts. And it's not good enough to blame the career gap, which goes with so many women taking time out off work to have and bring up children, because the above figures include women that do not have children. The Financial Services Council has estimated that there is a retirement savings gap of over $330 billion for women. Perhaps most compellingly, only 2 in 10 single women retiring today have enough savings for a comfortable retirement. Compare this to men, where around 5 in 10 men meet this benchmark. The system simply needs to perform better when it comes to women. Women live longer than men, making it even more imperative to give them a retirement income system strong enough to see them through a longer retirement. Australian women can expect to live in retirement for just over 24 years, whilst the average Australian man will enjoy retirement for just on 19 years. And yet, for those who need superannuation the most, Australia's women, we provide the least. In 2011-12, women held just 36% of Australia's superannuation savings. And while 26% of Australian men reported having no superannuation at all, the equivalent figure for females was close to 35%. Now, in my mind, there are 2 types of policy responses to this unacceptable situation. General measures to improve the equity of superannuation tax concessions across the income spectrum, and then targeted measures which deal with women in particular. Now, Australia's low-income earners are dominated, of course, by females. Full-time working women earn around $15,000 less per annum than the average full-time male. Over a typical working life, this equates to a gender income gap of around $700,000. Measures which give lower income workers a fairer go from our superannuation system will inevitably benefit women the most. We know that the superannuation tax concessions largely accrue to those at the top of the income scales. The current system sees close to 40% of all concessions flowing to the top 10% of income earners. This means that 40% of all concessions accrue to people who are not at risk of fronting up to the local Centrelink office to pick up their pension. Of course, most of this top cohort is represented by men. Tax concessions for superannuation are the fastest growing tax concession in the federal budget. They're growing at 4 times the rate of the age pension, and they will exceed the entire cost of the age pension within just 4 years. They are unsustainable and they are unfair. They're unfair to Australia's low-income workers and unfair to Australia's women. They represent a deliberate transfer of wealth from women to men. We've announced a policy to rein in some of the concessions which typically flow to people with superannuation balances in excess of $1.5 million. We'll take this policy to the next election and we'll implement it if we win. Now, the government's decided to play a base scare campaign with superannuation instead of engaging in a mature discussion about the equity and sustainability of the system. Now, while the government plays word games about raids on retirement income, the alternative government is showing the leadership required. The fact is that people on our lowest incomes don't receive any concession when it comes to contributing to their superannuation fund. Rice-Warner analysis, commissioned by Industry Super, shows that for people in the bottom income decile, the current superannuation system actually costs them money. In fact, it costs single females in this decile over $32,000, or about 3 years of work over their working life. Even for women in the bottom 20% of income earners, the superannuation system costs them money. Now compare this to the top end. The same Rice-Warner analysis shows that the top 10% of male income earners receive a benefit of around $1.5 million in concessions over their lifetime. Now, improving this situation was one of the reasons why the previous Labor government established the Low Income Superannuation Contribution, or the LISC, when I was Minister for Superannuation. The LISC gave a $500 superannuation top-up to those Australians who need it the most. It effectively gave low-income Australians tax relief for their superannuation that some high-income earners in Australia take for granted. The establishment of the LISC, together with the increase in the superannuation guarantee, would have increased Australia's national pool of savings in superannuation by $500 billion by 2037. This government has shamefully abolished the LISC in one of its most retrograde steps. This terrible policy decision will see millions of women starved of any concession when contributing to their superannuation fund. This is a government which dares to lecture us about making changes to superannuation policy when they themselves are responsible for the single most retrograde and regrettable policy decision made since the establishment of superannuation. 2 years ago, the Prime Minister appointed himself Minister for Women, and yet the single biggest policy decision his government has made when it comes to impact on women is a very retrograde one. Ruling out changes to reforming tax concessions, together with the abolition of the list, the government is effectively helping cement the current gender gap. Secondly, there are specific policy measures which can be considered, which target the retirement income gap. When Bill Shorten and I announced our proposed changes to high-income superannuation concessions earlier in the year, we said that it would be the be-all and end-all of changes we would make to the taxation concessions at the higher end. But it is not the be-all and end-all of our superannuation policy. I said at the time we'd make further announcements about our superannuation policy for lower income Australians, with a particular focus on the gender gap in retirement incomes. We've continued to work and consult, and we will have more to say about this. I'm also very pleased that Senator Jenny McAllister, a new and very talented senator from New South Wales, has moved to establish a Senate inquiry to look at what changes can be made to ensure that women are able to retire with the same level of comfort and security as men. I'll be taking this committee's work and recommendations seriously as we put the finishing touches on our policy. And while the current government seems oblivious to the problem of gender inequity in superannuation, I should note that the private sector is not. Several companies are showing leadership, which I want to acknowledge and recognise today. In recent weeks, the ANZ Banks released a comprehensive piece of work, its Women's Report, outlining the challenges facing women around the country. And the ANZ is not just talking about the problem. ANZ will provide top-up superannuation contributions of $500 a year for female staff in Australia. They will also pay superannuation contributions on parental leave for up to 24 months. This is a worthy move. They should be congratulated for it. ANZ is a large employer of women, and their actions will make a real difference for thousands of employees. But imagine how much more powerful their actions would be if they are accompanied and matched by an interest from the federal government. A number of companies have decided to make greater contributions to superannuation accounts for their female employees in a contribution to closing the gender gap. Rice Warner was, I believe, the first company to do so, but they're being joined by others. At the moment, getting permission to do this involves a bureaucratic process of approval, which could sensibly be done away with. My understanding is that every employer who's applied to the Human Rights Commission for permission to discriminate in favour of female employees in this regard has received it. So it would be sensible to remove the red tape which goes with obliging employers and make it simple and the process easier to pay women more in their superannuation. Now, another idea that is worthy of further consideration in my view is the introduction of joint superannuation accounts. Joint bank accounts are of course a fact of life, but joint superannuation accounts are not. In effect, the only way to get a joint superannuation account is to move to the self-managed sector of superannuation. I can see some advantages to allowing voluntary joint superannuation accounts. We've worked hard to reduce the number of accounts in the system, to improve efficiency and to reduce the whittling away of super by fees. It's a lot of Jeremy Cooper's work in the Cooper Review. But perhaps introducing joint accounts might assist in this process considerably. Joint accounts might also deal with the matter of gender inequality. There will be other views about the pros and cons of introducing joint accounts. I'm very open-minded about the proposition. I'm hopeful that Senator McAllister's committee can consider the pros and cons and make a recommendation, one that I would consider. I've just mentioned two possible policy ideas which would potentially make a modest but useful contribution to dealing with this iniquitous scourge of retirement income disparity. There are other views that we've considered and other ideas that we're working on. We'll continue to work on them and make further announcements. But simply shrugging our shoulders and saying it's all too hard is not an acceptable approach for anybody who cares about fairness in policy. We in Labor will deal and tackle the matter of gender inequality in retirement incomes, even if this government is, as they seem to be, entirely disinterested. And this week, giving this speech, I also want to acknowledge, in passing, the great work that Elizabeth Broderick has done in her 8 years as Sex Discrimination Commissioner, which comes to an end this week. She should be congratulated on her achievements, and she should be wished luck in her future endeavours. Can I conclude now by thanking you again for the invitation to be here. Compulsory universal superannuation is one of Labor's proudest ever achievements. It's served Australia very well. It's given millions of Australians a more dignified retirement, taken pressure off the age pension and lubricated the economy with capital when it's needed it the most. But the case for improving it so it can play an even better role in the future is very strong. As the Alternative Treasurer, I affirm to you strongly that unless and until female Australians get a fairer and better return for our superannuation system, it will not be delivering what it should, a fair and sustainable retirement income system. So in this period, when reform is on everybody's lips, let's not forget that half of Australia's population is not getting fairness when it comes to a dignified retirement. And let us not let these Australians be forgotten as we engage in important discussions on reform. Thank you very much.